Guy, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Pleasure to be here with you again. Nice to see you again.
Fantastic. Okay, the first thing I'd like to ask you is, could you tell us about yourself and your journey to this point?
Well, if we start at the beginning actually is slightly disappointing for those who are interested in grand designs and grand ambitions. I came to law because actually what interested me when I was young was playing sport, playing rugby. And I finished my university degree, which was a history degree. And I really want to stay another year to play rugby again in the university rugby team. The only course left open at that time, because I left it so late, was law. And so I took that and I discovered a whole new world opened up to me. So I'm a great fan of people seizing opportunities when they arrive and not being bothered when they arrive accidentally, because for me, that was the start of a whole career, which was essentially an accident.
That is incredible. And so the accident, and thank goodness the accident happened. So the accident, what happened? You start. I mean, tell us a little bit about the actual career itself.
Well, when I came to study law, I discovered that a lot of it seemed far more logical to me than I thought it would be. It all fell into place. I was very interested in contract law, tort law, and constitutional law, simply because I think they were extraordinarily relevant to how people lived their lives. I took my first and effectively only job for the next 30 years in a city law firm. So that meant I went into the world of commercial law. And I think this is relevant for where I hope we'll end up today. I observed in the first 10 years of what I did that there was essentially a great divide between those who practiced law in the commercial field, whose clients were largely business clients, often corporate clients, not always, but often corporate clients, and those who practiced essentially what you might say social welfare law, who operated in the public sphere and whose clients tended to be individuals. And it seemed to be assumed that these two worlds did not meet. And it did take me a long time to work out that this was a very false divide, and that the law is at the heart of a series of things, and justice is at the heart of a series of things, which is what Justice Live is all about. And that these were not different worlds at all, but yet they organized themselves differently. And certainly those in the commercial law sphere did not seem to have much time for social welfare law because it wasn't simply part of what they did. It wasn't part of their practice. So, of course, if you fast forward 30 years, commercial law firms became very big businesses. Big businesses accepted that they couldn't operate within society unless they took the interest, the public interest, the wider interest of society into account in what they did. And this, in a sense, brought those big firms back to thinking, well, what was their role in the provision of social welfare law? Because social welfare law was significantly neglected. It was under-resourced. Now, there's a big issue. It still is under-resourced. But at least now there's a degree of connection between the commercial end of the law and the social welfare end. And that heavily influenced what I did when I finished effectively my first career, because the second career has been, I think, as with most people, you spend the second part of your career putting into practice the things that it took you the first part of your career to learn. And I'm now very interested in the connection between social welfare law and the social significance of the law and commercial law.
Thank you, Guy. Can I ask you, did you ever, and I think the answer is yes, but I want to ask you, you actually judged things, didn't you, yourself?
Well, not, no, I think you'd be in trouble if I was judging anything. What happens, I got to a position, essentially becoming sort of chairman and leader of my own firm, which was a global law firm, which is a very big business. So, in simple terms, it was £1 billion plus turnover business. And I realized that it was open to us to support a series of activities. And we used to, as all major law firms now do, support our own staff in giving pro bono advice in law centers, which offer legal advice free. We also supported activities in schools where you would try to bring into the school curriculum, which is very crowded, some understanding of the significance of not just the law and justice, but also the rule of law, which is a different and slightly more complex point than people think. And so, I was able then to become involved in a number of projects which were helping, if you like, the channels for social welfare law in practice. And of course, what this revealed very clearly was that there was a large world of people who were hugely motivated lawyers who were doing far more valuable work than the very highly paid lawyers of whom I was one, but without recognition and largely without understanding of the work that they did or the level to which they committed themselves personally to doing it. So, no, I don't think I really sort of judged anything, but I was able then to have a much closer involvement with organizations which had really very little resource, but did remarkable things. And that was, for me, it was a real eye-opener.
Amazing. Incredible guy. Absolutely wonderful. You touched then about the rule of law. I mean, we are talking today on the Day of International Criminal Justice. Tell me, what does a day of criminal justice mean for you, and what's its importance?
Well, I think one has to be careful about sort of making grand statements, because for the people who suffer criminal oppression, other people having a day doesn't help them greatly. But unless there is recognition and thought given to these grand principles, we won't actually improve what happens and the outcomes for people on the ground. So the principles are very important. What it really means for me is a slightly wider point, which goes beyond criminal justice and it goes to civil justice as well, which is simply this, and this is the sort of fundamental connection between economic prosperity and the law. But I think how to put it, the creation and the fair distribution of economic prosperity can never be achieved without the rule of law. And of course, then that leads you to think, well, the aspirations that Peace One Day has for peace cannot be achieved without the rule of law. And you come to realize it's the fundamental sort of underpinning of economic prosperity, without which none of these other great aspirations can be achieved. And I think that there is a sense in which governments still don't quite understand, for example, for their own economic interest, the significance of the rule of law. And that is evident from the actions of governments, frankly, in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Europe, before you get to some less developed economies. And this is a great blind spot, because if governments accept that the rule of law is in the economic interest, it's then an economic issue. And currently, many of the manifestations of rule of law, when people talk about human rights, when they talk about modern slavery, when they talk about environmental justice, those tend to get transformed into political issues. And then they become part of really a rather sterile political debate. If you say no, it's an economic issue, and you won't have prosperity which will enable you to create broader fairness in these other areas without the rule of law. it's then worth pursuing. It's very difficult, though, to persuade governments, let alone large corporations, that this is really, it's not just an issue of public interest, it's an issue of self-interest as well. And where those two things coincide, you ought to have huge activity, and yet we don't. And I don't think people quite understand how they do coincide, which is it's a great failing on the part of those of us who are trying to explain it. Actually, you can't sort of blame people for not understanding something who haven't explained it properly. But if you just look at the lack of interaction between economics as a science and law as jurisprudence, it's remarkable how economists tend to pick up on the institutions of law, the courts and so on, not realizing that it's a much more fundamental underpinning of how markets work long before you get to any disputes and how you resolve them. And that's I think is a big blind spot that we have to cure.
Yes, so very interesting. So a day like this obviously gives us an opportunity to have that kind of bigger, conversation that you were talking about then.
It absolutely does. And if you, it actually leads you to think about, well, how do you go about addressing that blind spot? There are very few, I mean, as you know, and you've very kindly offered a platform to the Bingham Center, which is an organization which its sole objective is to research, develop understanding of, and promote the rule of law. And so it's not essentially a lobby group, it's more of a think tank, because there's a huge deficit of understanding there. And when you say, well, why should organizations support that? Well, there's a level of, there should be a level of interest from states, groups of states, big municipal authorities, large companies, all the way to individuals. All of them actually have an economic interest in the rule of law as being a system which underpins international trade as well as international dealings between states and between corporations and between individuals. They all have an interest in it. There are remarkably few organizations in the world which are devoted to the rule of law, which makes you then see there's a great deficit in understanding. There are lots of organizations devoted to elements of it, to human rights and elements of that, to modern slavery, to a lot of the parts of what constitutes the rule of law. There are hardly any devoted to promoting understanding and adoption of the broad principles. And that is just remarkable if you accept the thesis that it's vital for economic prosperity.
Guy, can you tell me, we talked about then Bingham, and yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law absolutely fascinates me, and we've worked together a little bit in the past, because as you say, there will be no peace and justice if we don't have a strong rule of law. I mean, the two go absolutely hand in hand. They're inextricably linked. Could you tell us, for those who don't know, tell us about the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law? Why the name? When did it start? What's its mission?
Well, it started about 13 to 14 years ago. It started, one of my props, I've got everything here, is this book. Lord Bingham was I think was agreed to be the greatest English judge of the last 100 years, certainly, if not longer. And he wrote this book. Now, if I turn it that way, this is a book which covers the rule of law. It's not very long. One of the great principles of the rule of law is that law and justice systems should be accessible to people. And one of the things he would say is, actually, if you have a society where nobody can find out what the laws actually are, you're not complying with rule of law principles. And that is the case in many states which would see themselves as very advanced. So accessibility, this book is hugely accessible because he wrote it, I think, to be read by anybody. and you could. It doesn't take long to read, but it sets out the key principles are really interesting because they are things as you might expect, like fairness, predictability, accessibility, certainty of outcomes, the same procedures applying to all. All of these things are fundamental to it. If you go to a large multinational business and say, what are the things you need? They say, oh, well, we need a level playing field. We need fairness of outcomes when we go into new territories. We need certainty. We need to be able to work out what's actually going to happen, and then we can plan and invest or not accordingly. Those are all rule of law principles. So from that, he set up the Bingham Center, which would be devoted to promoting understanding and then adoption of rule of law principles. It's been going, so it's a charity, doesn't every year. I have the privilege of chairing the development committee, which means I've got to go and ask people for money. Every year, you've got to go out and start again because we raise probably about £2 million a year, and it's a huge effort to do that. And then we go out again the next year. But it is slightly sort of strange to me that it's such a struggle when the rule of law is fundamental to what states do, it's fundamental to what companies do, it's fundamental to what society wants to do, and it's fundamental to the lives of individuals. It's fundamental to preserving the environment, for example, because we can talk a little bit about that. We won't be able to do that without rule of law structures. So it's trying to remedy a blind spot. It has to do it, of course, without being seen to be dominated by any interest. So that means our support has to come from a very broad range of places and people, because, of course, one of the underlying principles is independence and fairness, and you have to be seen, therefore, as an organization, be independent, fair. So it's a brilliant organization, and we're of course, from year to year, it's wonderful. It's hugely motivating because you've got to raise the money for next year again, because whilst we have one or two supporters who support us multi-year, most of our support comes from year to year. So you've got to go out and sell yourself, and so it means you've got to constantly think about the relevance of what you're saying.
Yeah. Yes. It's well, look, you and I do a similar job in terms of fundraising, shall we say? Fundraising for peace and fundraising for the rule of law, as important as they are, is tough stuff. And there we are. We obviously carry on, and we'll always do, Guy, won't we? The very best we can, mainly because the rule of law is so fundamentally important to our survival. And that brings me on to the next question about how crucial are justice and the rule of law going to be in relation to humanity's survival?
Well, as I've said, I think when you drill down in any of the big challenges which face the world we live in, you come to the rule of law as the bedrock of any solution. And it's there. And, the environment is interesting because the preservation of the environment will not be possible, I think, unless there are structures which are accessible to everybody. So, the players in preservation of the environment are groupings of states, individual states, large multinational corporations who, in some cases, are larger than the smaller states, municipal organizations, which are very important and really control what happens very close to home for every citizen of every state. And then you've got groupings of individuals and individuals. Now, they actually all need a structure through which they can be held to account, but also for which they can hold each other to account, or else there won't be, there's no mechanism for improving things. And I think one of the things that particularly those who are environmentally active find very frustrating is finding structures that they can use to hold states, large corporations, municipal organizations to account. And of course, the rule of law, that's absolutely fundamental to that, because what it's saying is you have to have structures which can be understood by everybody, which are accessible to everybody, where the outcomes are certain, unpredictable, and which are fairly administered. And of course, that is often lacking. And one of the great features of environmental issues is that you will find, I guess, groupings of states and large corporations and municipal organizations wanting to commit to objectives which are very broad brush, very, very vague, and are very based in the future, significantly into the future. And the reason they want to do that is so that they can't be held to account for what they do or not do today. So coming back to your question, I mean, unless you can get the structures in place which will hold organizations to account essentially for what they invest now for the futures of everybody, you will struggle to see improvement. So getting those structures in place is absolutely fundamental to the outcomes of any organization which is seeking to preserve the environment for the future.
Yeah, thank you, Guy. Thank you. So very clear the kind of role that it's going to have to play. In fact, we're talking with KC Philippe Sands, who I'm sure you know well.
Yes, Philippe will give you a far better and detailed account, both actually in relation to international criminal justice, where he's got a real interest, but also in relation to the environment and the real need to empower all the players in that structure. Because, of course, it isn't just individuals saying, "Oh, the states will do nothing." There will be particular states who say, "Well, look, we would move if actually we could see that others moved as well." And so the need to build structures which operate through rule of law principles is absolutely paramount, and he will give you a far better account of that than I have done.
Well, you're very modest. He'll give me a different one. Yes, that's for sure. Okay. So, right. Could you give us an example? Because we talked about, the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, what an incredible organisation. And we'll talk a little bit later about how we can support it. Obviously, the rule of law, we've also spoken now about its significance. Could you give us an example of justice and the rule of law having a profound and inspirational impact in relation to humanity's survival? So if you think about the amazing things that justice and the rule of law have manifested in relation to our survival, what would be your sort of go-to inspirational case?
Well, if I'm being absolutely honest, it's almost the absence of absolute sort of knockout inspirational cases, which is the really worrying thing. But there are many. If you look at the area of modern slavery, that's been an interesting area of great development, and in fact it's simply accepted now. I think as the norm that states, large companies, and all others have a duty to prevent modern slavery, and that's been instituted into the structures which they now have to abide by. That change actually has come about quite, in relative terms, quite swiftly in the last 10 years. It actually could go a whole step further to have supranational, international organizations creating structures now by which the accountability of all players. And interestingly, when this first emerged, large corporations who found themselves sort of in what they saw as the firing line on it, felt that this was very much an issue of distant supply chains in other parts of the world, which you had to simply had to go and inspect, and that was sort of all you could do. actually it's become apparent that that's not the case at all. That is an issue. There are significant modern slavery problems embedded in all major economies. So, this is a question of self-scrutiny. And what those organizations have come to accept now is that, in fact, it's economically desirable to eradicate modern slavery for a whole variety of reasons, which don't just relate to supply chain issues. So it's become an economic norm that modern slavery is unacceptable. Now, you could say that is an example of rule of law principles becoming accepted and embedded. But as I said to you, the worrying thing is that there's a whole series of areas where that has not yet happened. And that's, if I keep coming back to, that's really to do with the sort of the blind spot that I think most particularly governments and large corporations have in not directly linking the adoption of rule of law principles right across the board with economic prosperity. And as I said, I hope once they get that, there would then be my answer to that question would actually have a range of other things in there as well.
Okay, so what you're effectively saying is your real inspiration, comes from almost a lack of being inspired, and it's your inspiration and your desire to work hard is based on there's a lot of work to do in order for us to survive.
Yes, that's entirely fair, and it sort of brings us back full circle to where we started, really, that the divide that I'd seen early in my career between commercial lawyers and the areas of social welfare law, and the fact people thought they weren't connected. Actually, one of the purposes of social welfare law, which is issues like housing, debt, how to deal with debt, benefits, how to access benefits you're entitled to, employment law issues, discrimination, and a range of things of that nature, is, yes, those are things which you would say as a matter of principle are fair and desirable. What they also do is they unlock the potential of a series of individuals who because of problems in those areas, aren't able to function properly. But it also unlocks their economic potential as part of society. So even there, the argument is very much one of economics. And if that were accepted, you get this very strange reasoning, certainly sadly in government in this country, which is that no, you don't invest in all that because you can't work out what the value of that economic potential is. Now, that's a very strange line of argument, and you might say completely asymmetrical, because government has disinvested in those areas without working out what the financial cost of that disinvestment is. So it's sort of okay to disinvest, but not okay to invest, because we don't really understand the economic significance of all of this. That's a nonsense. And it is a very sad nonsense, which I hope will people are now coming around to understanding actually it's the wrong way of looking at it. And of course, what you tend to find is if you have, for example, a disinvestment in trying to solve people's housing problems or their debt problems, you displace their problems so that they don't emerge in those areas, because those will actually present legal problems which are capable of being addressed. Normally, they will then displace those problems to emerge in housing budgets or in health budgets most often, or in criminal law budgets. And there seems to be a sort of disconnect. People don't understand that you're shifting these problems across to much more expensive solutions. The result of that, for example, is you get very interesting modern initiatives, which are not for today, maybe for another time, health justice partnerships, which are really setting up social welfare organizations to say, actually, for problems which present as medical problems, and if a patient presents maybe with depression, that could be to do with debt problems, with respiratory problems, that could be to do with problems with their accommodation and the state of that. Those are actually medical problems which have a legal solution. So you should socially prescribe a legal solution. But it's the lack of the joined up understanding that it really, keep coming back to the same point, you get to sort of rule of law and justice systems are the bedrock of absolutely everything. And unless you get an economic understanding of that, you will have great injustices, but they will be very expensive injustices. So not only are they infringement, if you like, of the rights of the individual who suffers the injustice, they actually reduce the economic prosperity of the whole, of everybody. And this makes no sense.
Guy, do you have, when I look at everything that's going on in the world, and even this weekend hear of Paul Polman, who former CEO of Unilever, really talking about the knife edge now that we're on in relation to heating up, going beyond the 1.5. I see the Secretary General of the UN at the weekend saying we are in an absolute climate catastrophe now. We look at the situations in Europe and the rest of the world, in terms of conflicts and the kinds of big global plays that clearly are going on. And I sort of worry, in fact, if I think about it too long, I could get upset, guys, you can hear. And it's a terrible situation we're in, I think. And so I want to know what your sort of feelings are on this before I ask you the two final questions. I mean, how are you seeing things, Guy? Where does the hope come for you?
Well, the hope has got to be there, or else you will become inactive and fairly useless. It is true that there are a range of significant problems stacking up. The only thing I'd say is the advice I sort of normally give to people is things are never quite as bad as they seem. I don't know why that's the case, but I've always found it to be true. And that means it's never too late to act. When transformational activity comes, it comes very quickly. And then things people have opened up to them. I mean, I come from Northern Ireland. The peace process and the Good Friday Agreement sort of almost turned a series of things on their head. Now, it wasn't, you can see by recent years, there are still major problems, but those problems are a shadow of the problems which existed before that process. So when things turn, they do turn very quickly. So that is the hope, particularly in relation to, I suppose, international action on the environment. The obvious thing there is, in fact, it needs governments with the courage to act unilaterally. And maybe those will emerge. So in other words, this idea, well, we've got to get everybody to the same point. At some point, you would hope that governments will realize politically that it will be attractive to their electorates if they act and commit unilaterally. Even if people say, well, that, puts you at an economic disadvantage to competitors, it might do. But in fact, it'll probably turn out to be a first mover advantage and not an embedded disadvantage. That, I think, is where the progress is going to come, where one would hope you'll get some government saying, look, if we sit in our hands any longer, the damage we cause will be immense. And they'll have the courage to say to their electorates, actually, you've got to look beyond the next couple of years to the greater prize. And I think this is where the hope comes. I think they'll be very pleasantly surprised by the reaction of their electorates if any government was willing to take that longer term view.
Okay. Okay, Guy, thank you for that. So, what advice would you give to the young guy who actually wanted to be a rugby star? It probably was, I'm sure. But before you became the lawyer you are, or were. So what advice would you give to a young person who's thinking of going into the legal profession?
Well, the main thing, which is the advice I do give, is that don't be taken in by this idea that there is a divide between the highly paid, business focused, commercial law end of the law and the practice of social welfare law. There is no divide. There's a big divide in how people treat them, how they pay them, and how they're regarded, which isn't right. But the two are very intimately connected. And for large corporations to benefit economically from the rule of law, actually there needs to be the underpinning of the social welfare justice system underneath. So you can't have one without the other. So my advice would be actually go, instead of struggling, as many people do, to get internships at smart and large international law firms, go to an advice center or a law center near you and say, can I help you for 3 months? And they will say yes. And if you do that, you will actually have, I think, a perspective on the law and the significance of the law, which it took me decades to work out. You'll have that perspective from the very beginning. You also find nowadays that actually all employers, if you're starting out in the law, recognize that that experience of dealing with real people in real circumstances with real problems is invaluable. So I would say it doesn't matter what area of the law you want to go into, make sure you understand the whole spectrum and get some look at it before you start, because that will educate you as to which part of the law you want to go into for a start. But it will also give you that understanding of the broad connection and significance of the whole of justice systems and why actually you can't pick them apart.
That is incredible advice. I just know that's incredible advice. I mean, it just makes complete sense. You know, you want to be a part of the team, then you have to know about we're putting on the wheels, cleaning the engines, driving the car, you know what I mean? Planning, strategizing, fuel a car. I mean, it's just, to use a racing analogy, I mean, you're totally right. We have loads of interns who come here too, Guy, and I always think to them, you know, you're really at the sharp end of what it takes to, you know, manifest awareness of peace, which leads to action, you know what I mean, by having a little bit of time with us. So that is superb advice, and I hope people follow you. Thank you for that. Okay, is there anything, Guy, finally, is there anything that individuals can do to support justice and a strong rule of law? And, you know, firstly, is there anything we can do as individuals? And then secondly, and most importantly, you know, what non-profits or charities that are helping vulnerable people and this planet would you recommend for individuals to support? I think I know the answer of that one. There's got to be the Bingham Centre of the Rule of Law. But
I've done the Bingham pitch, so I would take that one as read. But for individuals, this is really important, I think. In a sense, it's always very difficult to say, look, you know, you go out and actually do something, take some action which has significant effect. Actually, individuals can change thinking. So if you, you know, if you're fortunate to be in employment, look at your organization and say to them, well, actually, to what extent have you examined, if you're in a large company, have you examined why the rule of law should be significant to the outcomes for us as a company? And, you know, that may well, if it's a big multinational organization, their risk register will have things to do with the level playing field when you invest in new territories, do with supply chain issues, which may be to do with modern slavery, or maybe to do with the degree to which you can actually enforce your contracts. If it's a national organization, it will be similar issues actually, but in a national setting. So I think what people can do is to challenge thinking and say, well, why? At the very least, say to your MP, why don't you do an economic analysis of the value of legal aid against rule of law principles, and see how it measures up? Because it won't. So I think it's to do with changing thinking, because you're right. Most people say, well, what can I do on my own? When large, and in fact, I've had large companies say that to me, and the answer to them is, well, actually act collectively with other large companies, and then you really are powerful, because then you actually carry a lot of clout when you face up to government or governmental authorities. So I think it's actually changing thinking. In terms of the other part of your question about organizations, I mean, clearly the Bingham Center is there. Goes back to my earlier point. Look at the organizations across the country, which will either be things like their advice sector organizations, who, free of charge, because one of the great shortcomings, scandals of our time is that even in developed economies, about 50% of citizens don't think they can afford paid for access to the law. And that's, that could be access to deal with issues they have in their personal lives. So I'm not talking about, I want to go out and set up a company or something like that. I'm saying you've got an issue with housing, got an issue with employment, you've got an issue with care, access to care. That's a really big issue. Those all have legal underpinnings, and without the legal underpinning, you can't address them. Most people believe they can't afford that. There are organizations which will be law centers. They may be specialist advice organizations in particular areas to do with care in the community, mental health, immigration. So that there's a whole range of organizations which are all charities, because they have to be. They're all deserving of your help. And actually, for most people who have time as well, will find that they'll love it if you give them a bit of money. They'll love you even more if you give them some of your time. And those are the organizations. Citizens Advice Bureau do the same as well. So they will just love it if actually you say, I'm here in two capacities. I'll give you a bit of support financially, but I'll also give you my time. And they really are the organizations. And making those organizations develop and prosper is not just a question of doing the right thing. That contributes to economic prosperity as well. And that's the bit coming back to, which I think is overlooked and misunderstood.
Well, Guy, we've come to the end of our interview, sadly for me. Absolute pleasure to listen to you today. Thank you so much for participating.
The pleasure, as always, Jem, is all mine. It was a great privilege. Thank you so much, and good luck with everything you're doing.
Thank you, Guy.